The airlock hissed open with the usual sterile finality aboard the diplomatic cruiser Varelian. 3 members of the Galactic Concord stepped into the hold, carrying a half-conscious creature slung across a gravity stretcher. It was massive, nearly 3 meters in length, lean and sinewed, covered in matte gray fur matted with blood and plasma burns. Its elongated snout was twisted in pain, and one of its rear legs hung at an unnatural angle. Ambassador Tovik's antennae twitched nervously as he stared at the motionless body. "Why did it attack the war drones in the first place?" he asked. Commander Ural kept his 6 eyes fixed on the creature. "Because it's not an animal. It's a Varnokian Direwolf. Intelligent, loyal, and now wounded because it protected a civilian transport during the ambush on Sector 9. Why didn't it retreat with the rest of its pack?" Tovik asked. "It was left behind. Broken leg, plasma across its ribcage. The others wouldn't risk extraction under fire." Tovik turned toward the stretchers. "So what now?" "We freed it," Ural replied, "but none of our med units can handle its physiology. We've tried sedatives, but its neural pathways reject synthetics. It's in agony, and if we don't treat it soon, it'll die. Then put it out of its misery." "No," Ural said firmly. "It fought for us. We owe it." As the debate continued, the human delegation arrived, led by Marcus Dallin. He wore the simple navy field jacket of the Earth Colonial Medical Corps and walked with the slight limp he'd earned during the quake on Row 4. Behind him trailed a young assistant pushing a portable diagnostic unit. Marcus paused at the sight of the wounded creature. "What the hell is that?" "A Varnokian Direwolf," Ural answered. "Loyal to its handlers, but aggressive if provoked. It saved a transport ship. We retrieved it under fire. Now it's dying." "So why am I here?" Marcus asked. "Because no one else dared to touch it." He approached the stretcher slowly. The direwolf's single open eye tracked him, pupils dilated, breath shallow. Its ribcage rose and fell in irregular spurts. "You sure it's not going to rip my throat out?" Marcus asked. "It's too weak," Ural said. "But if you touch the wrong nerve cluster, it might try." Marcus knelt, powered up his diagnostic pad, and scanned the creature. Fractured femur, internal bleeding, plasma scoring over its left lung. "You're right. None of your tech's going to help this thing. So you'll try?" Tovik asked. Marcus looked up. "Yeah, but I'll need a sterile field, bone graft materials, and old-fashioned surgical tools. No auto-nano units. They'll just destabilize its tissue." "We can prepare a medbay," Ural said. Marcus turned to his assistant. "Get the prep team. And message my surgical AI we're going to need custom overlays." The assistant nodded and ran off. As the direwolf was moved, Marcus walked beside the stretcher, one hand hovering just above the creature's flank. The eye followed him the whole way. By the time the sterile pod was ready, Marcus had already scrubbed in. The room was filled with unfamiliar instruments, some from Varnokian biology files, others modified Earth tools. For 2 hours he worked in silence, save for short commands to the AI and his assistant. "Clamp that artery. Hold retractor at 45 degrees. No, not there, its nerve sheath runs parallel." The direwolf's breathing steadied as the bleeding was controlled. The broken femur was set using a mechanical brace. The plasma burns were debrided by hand, layer by layer. When he finally stepped back, soaked in sweat, Marcus exhaled. "We'll see if it makes it through the night." Ural waited outside the pod. "You risked a lot," he said. "I'm a field surgeon," Marcus replied. "Risk's part of the job." "No," Ural said. "This creature's killed before. It's considered sacred by some Varnokian clans. If it dies, we'll have to answer for it. If it lives well, we still might." Marcus shrugged. "Then let's hope I did a good job." Over the next few days, the direwolf remained sedated, pulse steady but weak. Marcus checked on it every 6 hours, adjusting medications, monitoring fluid intake, and changing bandages by hand. He refused automated assistance, citing incompatibility with its physiology. On day 5, the creature woke. Marcus was at the edge of the medpod, checking vitals, when the direwolf's eye opened. It didn't growl, didn't move, just stared at him. He froze. "Hey," he said softly. "You're awake." The eye blinked once. Marcus reached for the water dish and slid it closer. "I don't know if you understand me, but you're going to need to drink." The direwolf shifted, groaned, and then slowly pressed its snout to the edge of the dish. Marcus exhaled. "That's right. Easy." Tovik entered the pod room later that day with a data slate. "The Varnokian High Matron has requested an update. She believed the direwolf was lost. It's alive, Marcus replied. Barely. But it's eating and drinking now. She wishes to see it. Marcus hesitated. It's still recovering. External stimuli could stress its healing. She insists. The High Matron arrived the next morning. Her exosuit gleamed with ceremonial gold and her eyes glowed faint lavender. She approached the pod without hesitation, knelt beside the direwolf, and placed her hand gently on its shoulder. The creature leaned into her touch. Marcus watched from the window, arms folded. Well, he muttered, guess I passed. That night, the direwolf attempted to stand. Its rear leg trembled under its weight and it collapsed back onto the bed. Marcus rushed in. Too soon, he said. You'll tear the graft. The eye locked onto his again. It looked frustrated, if that was even possible. Marcus crouched beside it. You want to move. I get it. But if you do that again, you're going to snap that femur and I'll have to re-break it. A low rumble echoed from the direwolf's chest. Yeah, growl all you want. You're not going anywhere. He stood and adjusted the leg brace. You're going to start with assisted standing. 3 weeks minimum. Then we'll talk walking. The direwolf didn't try to move again that night. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus implemented a careful rehab plan. The direwolf was fitted with a custom mobility harness, and Marcus personally guided its limited walking sessions. Every step was measured, every motion controlled. Ural watched during one of the sessions. You know, he said, I've never seen one of them let anyone touch it like that. Maybe it knows I'm the reason it's still alive, Marcus said. Maybe it knows you're too stubborn to quit. Marcus glanced at the creature. That too. By the 6th week, the direwolf could walk short distances. The burns had healed into silver scars. The femur had knitted properly, confirmed by scans. But Marcus noticed something else whenever he entered the mebe. The direwolf's ears would perk up. It would watch him until he left. No one else got that reaction. Tovik brought news. The High Matron wants it returned. She's sending a retrieval team. Marcus nodded. It's strong enough now. But she should know its gait will never be perfect. That leg's going to have a hitch. She knows. She says it will wear the wound with honor. The day of departure, Marcus approached the creature one last time. He rested a hand on its shoulder, careful not to press on the scar tissue. You're not going to remember me, he said. But I'll remember you. The direwolf leaned forward and pressed its forehead lightly against his chest. Marcus froze. Then he smiled. The creature stepped onto the retrieval platform without resistance. As the transport doors closed, Marcus turned away, already thinking about the next patient. But for just a moment, he let himself feel the weight of what had happened. He had treated a creature no one else dared touch. And it had survived. The Varnokian shuttle barely cleared the cruiser's gravity well before the alarms started. Marcus was halfway through sterilizing surgical tools when the corridor lights shifted to amber. An automated voice announced a hull breach on Deck 6, then cut off mid-sentence. The gravity flickered, stuttered, and then returned. A second later, the floor trembled beneath his feet. He grabbed the emergency comm unit from the wall. What the hell happened? A voice crackled through. Unknown impact. Forward sensor array blinded. We've lost contact with the escort frigate. Marcus pulled the tray of scalpels off the counter and shoved them into a containment drawer. Anyone injured? Medbay's getting reports. Lots of them. He was already moving. By the time he reached the triage corridor, the area was chaos. Drones buzzed overhead scanning injuries. A Corellian lieutenant with half his carapace burned was being stabilized on an anti-shock slab. 2 humans in exosuits dragged in a limp body another technician, covered in soot, breathing shallow. Marcus didn't wait for the diagnostics. Get the thoracic tray. We've got pulmonary collapse. The technician's neck twitched as Marcus inserted a decompression needle between the ribs. Air hissed out. The chest cavity slowly reinflated. The man gasped, eyes fluttering. Keep him upright. No morphogenics. Just stabilizers, Marcus ordered. A medical drone hovered over a second patient of Aurelian. One arm mangled and hanging loose. Marcus scanned the trauma. Joints gone. Full disarticulation. Prep for synthetic graft. But clear the nerve stubs first or the prosthetics won't sink. The drone emitted a confirmation tone and began its work. 3 hours later, the chaos had receded to a dull background rhythm. The triage area still smelled of scorched polyfiber and antiseptic foam. Marcus knelt beside a young ensign whose leg had been shattered by falling debris. She was conscious, barely. "I need you to stay awake," he said, inspecting the damage. She tried to nod, but her head lolled. Her femur had splintered into 5 pieces. One of them had nicked her femoral artery. He clamped it, then turned to his assistant. "High-tension splint. We use the bone printer after we stop internal bleeding." The assistant hesitated. "Shouldn't we wait for imaging scans?" Marcus didn't look up. "We don't have time for perfect. She's got 6 minutes before she bleeds out." He used a cauterizer to seal the vessel, then inserted a temporary carbon lattice to hold the fragments. By the time the bleeding stopped, her blood pressure was rising again. As he stood, wiping his gloves, the assistant asked, "You think this was sabotage?" Marcus peeled off the gloves. If it was, they weren't trying to kill the ship, just blind it. Later that cycle, a summons came through from security. Marcus was ushered into a small debrief room where Commander Ural sat across from a flickering holomap of the surrounding system. "The impact wasn't random," Ural said without preamble. "Something hit us at relativistic speed. No warning. No energy signature. Then it fragmented before we could trace it." Marcus crossed his arms. "You dragged me here because you think it's a biohazard?" "No, because we think it was a message." He leaned in. "From who?" Ural tapped the holomap, zooming in on a debris field. "We recovered fragments. Organic. Grown, not built. Some kind of engineered bone matrix. There's also this." He brought up a second image, a symbol etched into one of the fragments. A spiral intersected by a vertical slash. Marcus frowned. "That's Varnokian. Clan markings." "Correct. Clan Zervith. Excommunicated. Thought extinct." "That direwolf we just sent back, was it Zervith?" "No. But the matron who received it was." Marcus blinked. "You're telling me we just handed a living war relic to someone from a dead militant bloodline, and they thanked us with a kinetic strike?" "We're not sure it was her, but she left no contact signature when she departed. And now this." Marcus turned away, jaw tight. "So what, you want me to find her?" "I'm a surgeon." "No. We want to send you to the border." "Excuse me?" Ural stood. "You're the only human the Direwolf responded to. That makes you a symbol now. The Concord wants to send a delegation to the Varnokian frontier." "You'll be part of it. Send a diplomat. They're sending 6. But you're going too." 2 days later, Marcus was aboard the long-range diplomatic vessel Roxari, headed for the Varnokian frontier. The ship was less sterile than the cruiser, with paneled walls, atmospheric lighting, and a lounge that smelled faintly of cinnamon bark. He found the other delegates in the observation deck. A Terran linguist in a formal suit, a Zentari cultural liaison with feathered crest twitching nervously, 2 Vrelian academics, and a Bet-Ari priest who hadn't spoken a word since boarding. Marcus sat on the edge of a curved bench and stared out at the stars. The linguist broke the silence. "You're Dallin, right? The one who treated the direwolf." "That's me." "Why'd you do it?" Marcus didn't look away from the viewport. "Because I could." The Zentari tilted their head. "Do humans often risk themselves for creatures with unclear loyalties?" "Depends. Do you?" "We don't even risk ourselves for family." Marcus laughed once, dry. "Then yeah, I guess it's a human thing." 3 days into the journey, the ship dropped out of subspace near the Varnokian threshold. The system outside was barren brown dwarf, scattered moons, and a single orbital station shaped like an inverted claw. They docked in silence. Marcus followed the group through airlocks and into a reception chamber lined with vertical banners, each bearing variations of the spiral/symbol. A tall Varnokian approached, gaunt and scarred, one eye replaced by a crystalline implant. "I am Serene of Zervith," she said. "You are the human medic." Marcus nodded. Serene gestured. "Come." The others hesitated, but Marcus followed. They moved through quiet halls until they reached a wide chamber with a sunken floor. In the center lay the direwolf. It looked different now, bulkier. The scars on its flank had been marked with ceremonial dyes. Its harness was gone, replaced with a mantle of woven metal. Marcus stepped forward. The creature watched him. Then it stood no limp. The leg moved cleanly. "You rebuilt the bone?" Marcus asked. Serene nodded. "We used your graft as foundation. Grew the rest in resonance chambers." Marcus frowned. Then why bring me here? The direwolf stepped toward him, then lowered its head. Serene spoke. It has chosen a new bond. With you. Marcus blinked. I'm not Varnokian. It doesn't matter. You saved its life. That makes you kin. He crouched. I didn't do it for loyalty. Just survival. Serene nodded once. And that is why it trusts you. Marcus stared into the creature's eye. I can't take it with me. You must. It will not stay. The rest of the delegation found him an hour later, standing beside the direwolf on the edge of the launch bay. The linguist gaped. You're bringing that thing aboard? It's not a thing, Marcus said. It's my patient. The Bedari priest finally spoke, voice deep and amused. And now your shadow. Marcus touched the direwolf's shoulder. Let's go. They boarded in silence. As the ship lifted from the station, the creature sat beside him, still and watchful. No one else dared sit near them. And for the first time in weeks, Marcus felt like something had shifted. Not finished. Not resolved. But changed. The direwolf vomited into the waste locker at 0300 ship time. Marcus, roused by the low, strained whine vibrating through the bulkhead beside his cabin, bolted upright and stumbled into the corridor barefoot. The creature stood stiff-legged at the end of the hall, heaving again. Its flanks trembled with exertion and viscous black bile clung to the floor beneath it. He crouched without hesitation, one hand on its shoulder, the other checking its jaw for tension. The mucous membranes were pale, almost bluish. Its breathing was shallow, uneven in cadence, and its eyes were glassy. You didn't eat anything off the floor, did you? Marcus muttered, glancing toward the ventilation grills. Or chew through a conduit again. The direwolf let out a low, pained woof. The medical bay was already active by the time he guided it inside. He keyed in his override on the diagnostics unit and bypassed the programmed species presets. He inserted a sample probe into the bile and scanned the readings as they loaded. Elevated ammonia, disrupted metabolic enzymes, protein decay markers great, he said, scrubbing his face with one hand. You're reacting to the ship's recycled protein paste. The creature's stomach audibly churned. He opened the food synthesis panel, pulled out a nutrient pack, and tore it open. This stuff's formulated for Terran digestion, not semi-feral carnivores with hybrid livers. You need something closer to raw muscle tissue. He set the pack aside and keyed a custom order into the fabricator. Unprocessed meat. No preservatives. Low nitrate. Room temperature. The machine sputtered, clicked, and produced a tray of steaming gray strips. The direwolf sniffed, then took a tentative bite. Within seconds, it devoured the rest and lay down, panting. Marcus knelt beside it. You're going to need a specialized diet. Every day. Twice if we're active. He glanced toward the ceiling. Which means I now have to convince the ship's quartermaster to dedicate storage space to wolf-grade meat. The next morning, Marcus stood in the mess hall holding the empty food tray. No, the quartermaster said. Absolutely not. We're already rationing protein for the organics on board. I'm not allocating half our reserves to a glorified bioweapon. It's not a weapon, Marcus said, keeping his tone even. It's bonded. It's a member of the delegation. If it dies, we lose the only connection we've got to the Varnokian trust network. Then feed it less. You want it to start scavenging again? Because that's what it'll do. And the next time someone opens a maintenance panel and finds their power conduit half digested, I'm sending them to you. The quartermaster's jaw tightened. Fine. 1 crate of raw synth muscle. But you prep it. I'm not running a butcher's shop. Later that cycle, Marcus stood in the storage bay hacking apart a slab of synthetic bison flank with a carbon blade. You could have requested assistance, said the linguist, watching from the doorway. I did, Marcus replied. You said you were busy analyzing Varnokian verb tenses. I was. Still am. Then why are you here? To see if you'd cave and switch to nutrient slurry. Marcus dropped a severed chunk into the container. Not unless I want it vomiting up its spleen again. The linguist stepped closer. You ever think about what it means that it chose you? That it follows your voice? Not commands. I'm not interested in taming it. That's not what I asked. Marcus paused. No, I haven't thought about it. Because I've been too busy keeping it alive. By the end of the week, the ship had adjusted. The direwolf was assigned a corner of the observation deck, where it slept in a nest of thermal blankets. Crew members began giving it a wide berth. The air smelled faintly of iron and ozone where it sat, unmoving, for hours at a time. During crisis drills, it responded to alarms by standing and pacing. When the hull trembled during a solar flare, it positioned itself between Marcus and the outer bulkhead. They arrived at the Concorde's central arbitration ring 12 days after leaving the frontier. The artificial station hung in a permanent orbit around a neutron star, its structure latticed with solar shielding and layered gravity plates. Dozens of vessels orbited nearby, each bearing a different insignia. Marcus didn't bother changing out of his medical jacket. Protocol demanded formal attire, but he wasn't interested in impressing anyone. The direwolf walked beside him, silent and fluid, ignoring the stares as they entered the tribunal chamber. The chamber was circular, with tiered seating and a central dais. The delegates from the Varnokian enclave stood at one end, flanked by guards in dark armor. Across from them, Concorde representatives sat stiffly, their expressions unreadable. A facilitator, faceless beneath a translation mask, gestured to Marcus. "You are the human responsible for the creature's survival." "I am." "Then explain this," the facilitator said, gesturing to the direwolf. "Why is it here?" "Because it refused to stay behind." Gasps rippled through the chamber. The Varnokian envoy stepped forward. "We were told it was released to its clan, that the human relinquished it." Marcus met her gaze. "I did. But it followed. Tracked our ship for 6 systems. Docked itself inside an unpressurized maintenance hold. Nearly froze its lungs. I found it on the lower decks 2 days after departure." The envoy looked to her aides, murmured something in Varnokian dialect, then turned back. "We were not aware. I didn't tell anyone. I wanted to see if it would leave. It didn't." The room fell silent. The facilitator tilted its head. "And you believe this bond is voluntary?" "Completely." "Then what is your request?" Marcus glanced at the direwolf. "That it be registered as a civilian member of the Concorde, with full travel rights, no containment protocols, no dissection, no confiscation." Another wave of murmurs. The facilitator processed for several seconds. "This is unprecedented." The Varnokian envoy raised her hand. "We support it." The facilitator paused. "On what grounds?" The envoy stepped forward. "It is no longer Varnokian. Chose exile. It chose the human. Therefore, it is not ours to claim. But we will honor its choice." Approval came 3 hours later. The direwolf was assigned a designation number, a biometric ID, and, to Marcus's exasperation, a ceremonial sash indicating non-combatant status. Tore the sash off within minutes. No one replaced it. That evening, Marcus sat in the quiet of the observation deck, legs stretched out, his back against the wall. The direwolf lay beside him, head resting on its front paws. "You know," he said, "I've patched up humans with fewer organs than you, and they still found ways to complain more." The direwolf's ears twitched. He leaned his head back. "So what now? You going to follow me forever? Sit in on surgeries? Scare interns?" The creature didn't respond. Marcus closed his eyes. "Yeah, that's what I thought." The stars outside shifted slowly as the station rotated. Somewhere behind him, the ship's engines hummed a low, steady rhythm. He reached out, resting his hand lightly against the direwolf's shoulder. It didn't move away. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, Marcus didn't feel like he was waiting for the next emergency. He was exactly where he needed to be.